Any questions, anything in your minds? Anything in your minds? No? Okay. All right. Let's start off with this question. This is more of a polling question than a true-false question, but I want to explore the reason why people put various things yes or no to this question. So there's not really a right or wrong answer here, but I want to see what you think based on your readings for today. The question is this. The Constitution of 1787, that is, forget the 14th Amendment, forget subsequent amendments, excluded slaves from citizenship. True or false? Again, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here. To the extent that there is one, this isn't mine. What is this? Okay, see what you guys think. Under 10 or 15 seconds. And the slightest of a congestion today, but I think I'm okay. But I have a little lower voice than usual. All right. Let's see what we got here. Wow. That's pretty close. That's right around, straight down the middle. Straight down the middle. It's very, you guys are split on this one. All right. I don't remember where I was. Who's Cindy? All right, Cindy, what would you put here? True or false? Okay, tell me why. Okay. So when you say it didn't explicitly exclude slaves, did it implicitly exclude slaves? I'm just using your words here. Okay, how so? Okay. All right. Are you next on a card? What did you put here? False. Okay, you put false also. Okay. Any deviations from what Cindy said for your answer? Any difference?
Not really the same.
Okay. Okay. So she mentioned that under the Constitution, slaves were deemed property. But my question was about citizenship, not property. Is there anything in the Constitution about citizenship?
It doesn't really say yes or no. So.
What'd you put?
I also put.
All right, I want someone to put true, because I'll come back to you later. Who in this row put true? All right, yeah. What'd you put true?
Well, I put true because
But is there anything, again, I'm not saying you're right or wrong, but is there anything in here that says slaves are excluded from citizenship? Now, I like Cindy said explicit versus implicit. I think that's getting at the right answer. Anyone else in this row put true? Yeah, David.
Yeah, it's pretty much for the same reason that she said, but also because like in section 9.
Okay, let's go to the text. I have it up here. Which provision are you looking at, David?
I'm looking at Article 1, section 9.
Ah, the migration protection clause?
Yeah.
Tell me about this provision.
Well, I think that talks about such persons. I think they're implying slaves, but the fact that they're talking about them as the fact that they can be imported doesn't necessarily mean that they're valued as a citizen. They're seen more as like, as they were saying, property.
All right. So I'll go back to Witt for a minute, right? We know the 14th Amendment, right? It says, in no uncertain first sentence, right? All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside, right? No doubts about this. If you're born here, you're subject to our jurisdiction. That's excluding ambassadors, for example, and the children of ambassadors. You are a citizen. Now, Whit, what's a citizen? What is a citizen? It doesn't say what citizen means. It just says you are one. But To answer my question, right, the question I put at the beginning, you guys all jumped over a threshold issue, right? What is a citizen wit?
That's a really hard.
I know it is. That's why I asked it.
It's like the whole case.
Yeah, yeah. See, now you know why my questions have a purpose. To lead somewhere.
To me, I just thinking about the legal terms and trying to leave out my own sense of morality. Their view of citizenship, I agree with the dissent and how they said just because they have the right to.
You're not answering my question. You're giving me some other good stuff. My question was a lot simpler. What is citizen? What does that phrase mean? I'll come back to you in a second, Kevin. Just go down the line.
I guess someone that benefits from the laws of whatever.
Oh, okay. Name tag, sorry.
Oh, sorry, Janelle.
Janelli, thank you. Does the Constitution of 1787, not 14th Amendment, not 1868, does the Constitution of 1787 define citizenship, Janelli? No, you're not. No, it doesn't define citizenship. Is a yes or no answer? You're right. There's no definition in the Constitution of 1787 about what a citizen is or who is a citizen. It uses the phrases in a bunch of places, right? So, for example, the president must be a natural-born citizen. To be a member of the Senate, you have to be a citizen within 7 years. Or is it 9? To be a member of the House, you have to be a citizen for 7 years, right? There are specific references to citizens. Indeed, one of the most famous references is in Article 4 of the Constitution. This is the Privileges and Immunity Clause of Article 4. And it says, the citizens of each state shall be entitled to the privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. This provision means if you're a citizen of New York, and then you go to New Jersey treat their own citizens, right? But we have this phrase, right? Citizens of each state. And elsewhere it says citizens of the United States. Ah. So the Constitution doesn't spell out how to become a citizen, but it says there are two types of citizenship, state and federal. And with those citizenship, you can do different things. If you're a citizen of 7 years, you can run for the House, federal. And if you're a citizen of the state, you're given these privileges and rights. So Raquel, does the Constitution of 1787 define who is and is not a citizen? That was my question to begin class for today. So then how, under the Constitution of 1787, again, I'm not talking 14th Amendment, that's easy, but under the 1787 Constitution, are we to know if a given person, call him Dred Scott, for example, right? How is we supposed to know he is or is not a citizen? Does the Constitution answer this question? Okay. All right. Kevin, you were patiently waiting.
Well, I was going to say that it doesn't explicitly define it, but one, I think, requirement for citizenship is that you kind of have to be a person,
As opposed to a robot, or what do you mean?
opposed to maybe property or.
Well, where do you get that from? Where's it say to be a citizen? You have to be a person. I'm not being pedantic, but I'm just what clause are you looking at?
Oh, well, I was looking at for Section 9 of Article 1, where it says all such persons
Okay.
in any state, or such persons of the state, opposed to like property, or I guess someone who's maybe 3/5 of a person.
Okay. Jonathan?
Yeah, I was going to build on the 3/5, and if you look at the framer's intent, like no taxation.
I'm not going to intent. I'm just going to the text of the Constitution. The actual difference between intent and meaning are very distinct. We'll get to intent in a bit,
You
right?
don't think that 3/5 is enough to state that in 1787, before the Bill of Rights and everything, that was enough to establish that they were people that were recognized as political entities?
Okay, I'll ask this question for Ruth, right? let's answer Jonathan's question, right? Does the 3/5 compromise, where such persons were deemed to have only 3/5 for purposes of the representation and taxation, is that enough to disqualify that person from citizenship? And remember, we're talking about two types of citizenship here, right? There's state citizenship, and it's also U.S. citizenship. So is the 3/5 clause enough to disqualify you, Ruth? That's Jonathan's question.
If they're considered birth of a person or representation of the state, I don't see how they can't be considered a citizen.
Now, is that for federal citizenship or state citizenship?
That's
Well, what does the 3/5 clause apply to? What does it matter for? Is that for representation in Congress or the State House?
for the state. No,
Right, so last question again. I think you got it now, right? Does the 3/5 compromise speak to state citizenship or federal citizenship? Okay, very good. So, Jonathan, let me try your question a different way, right? Even if you're right that the 3/5 compromise denies a slave, for example, federal citizenship, does it answer the question of whether they can become state citizens and be entitled to these various privileges and immunities? A second, Cameron. Right? The Tawney opinion had to knock down both strands of citizenship to prevail. He had to say that they're not federal citizens, because that will get them to diversity jurisdiction. And he also had to say they can't be state citizens. That is, even if Massachusetts, Maine, Rhode Island, right, decide to bestow citizenship on the freedmen, they don't get that either. Why? This is Article 4. If people of African descent were able to get these privileges and immunities, then there's a credible argument that they can't be slaves. So the Tawney opinion, and this is why I'm focusing so much on citizenship, answers several of these questions, right? It asks to answer, are these citizens for purpose of federal law? And are these people citizens for purposes of state law? You need to knock both those down to get to its end. Right, so again, going back to my initial, I didn't forget about you. Going back to my initial question at the beginning, right? I think Cindy framed it well. Explicitly, right, there's nothing in the Constitution of 1787 that excludes slaves from citizenship. There's certainly nothing that excludes them, or free people of African descent from citizenship. But implicitly, Jonathan says 3/5 clause, right? You have the importation clause in Article 1, Section 9. Those seem to suggest a dual track, right? A dual status. Right? So you have explicit versus implicit. I like the way you framed that. Then also Jonathan raised a third point of intent, right? Even if the text of the Constitution is neutral, which maybe it is, maybe it's not. But let's say it is neutral for a minute. The intentions, Jonathan says, of the people who crafted the 3/5 clause were that there was not an equality of citizenship. He says the intentions of the people who drafted the importation clause was not to create this parallel, this symmetry between people of different colors, right? So this simply tees up the question of how do we read the Constitution, right? And the debate we're all having here is not new, right? This was a debate that was very prominent within abolitionist circles. When I say abolitionist, I'm referring to the abolition of slavery, the ending of slavery. You see that phrase in different contexts, but here I mean people who want to end slavery. And different wings of abolitionist thought read the Constitution like Jonathan, and other wings read it perhaps like maybe Cindy or Anakari, right? Where some people said, look, the framers were slave owners and they sought to perpetuate slavery, and even if they didn't write it explicitly into the Constitution, this was their original intent. And then you have the other wing. Oh, by the way, that was the Garrisonians. Garrison was the Jonathan perspective, right? You have the other perspective saying, look, let's just look at the text, right? The text doesn't speak of slavery. It doesn't deny citizenship. It leaves the issue open. So even today, we have this debate among judges. We look at text. We look at intent. How do we read a constitution? None of that's new. It actually stretches all the way back to the 1800s with this debate over slavery. But this question, which I don't have an answer. I go back and forth myself, and I wrote the damn thing, right? But this question that I put it for you at the outset, it in large measure turns on how you read the Constitution of 1787. Are you reading it based on the original intent? In which case, the answer is probably true, right? Or you're reading it based on the text, right? And I think there the answer is closer. Maybe false, maybe not, but I think it's a lot closer. All right, we get that. Cameron, patiently waiting, sir.
One thing, while I was reading this, the whole time I was expecting the three-fifths compromise to come up.
You're expecting what?
The three-fifths compromise to be brought up by somebody because it brings it out. But I was wondering, and I don't know if maybe this is because from a modern interpretation, but presumably there's talking about from reps and taxes, it's based off of citizens. And their qualifier here is numbers which shall be determined by adding to those number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term, and three-fifths of all other perfect persons. So it's either free persons or three-fifths of all other persons, which is slaves, which this didn't want to say. Does that mean if they've been freed, they're a free person, so you count as a full person?
Mm-hmm.
And does that, if we're based, and that's why I say I don't know, modern time, when it comes to that, citizens.
Right. So it's a little bit vague, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right. So everyone just go to three-fifths clause. What, do you have a page number, Cameron?
26.
Yeah, just turn to it, please. Let's read it. I forgot to paste that up there, but it's in there. Okay. It says, representation and direct tax shall be apportioned, blah, 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 according to respective numbers, comma, which shall be determined by adding the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, three-fifths for all the persons. Again, this speaks of different kinds of people. It doesn't speak of citizens, right? And I don't mean to focus on this point too much, but the reason why citizenship was so important was because of this provision, right? The Privileges and Immunities Clause. No one talks about this clause today, but this was like a really big deal before the 14th Amendment because it guaranteed certain rights and liberties. And if a slave, or even if a freedman, was deemed a citizen, then he was entitled to these rights, right? This is why everyone's a person, right? No one's doubting who a person is. Even says persons held to labor, right? I'm sorry, persons bound to service. So even if a slave is considered property, he's still a person by virtue of the Constitution, person. But the key word, citizen. Okay, everyone with me so far? Everyone get that basic gist. That's why the very first sentence of the 14th Amendment established, without any qualifications, if you were born here, you are not only a citizen of the United States, but you are also a citizen of the state where you reside in. And once you're a citizen of the state, you get those privileges or immunities, right? You get those rights. The very first sentence of the 14th Amendment overturned Dred Scott. Dred Scott v. Sandford, which we'll spend the entire class on today. Dred Scott v. Sandford was never overturned by the Supreme Court. In fact, if you pull it up in Westlaw, it's actually strange. It's a little red stop sign, whatever, right? And it says, a red flag, and it says, overturned by Amendment 14. You don't believe me, go look it up, right? It's there. But the Section 1 of the 14th Amendment nullified Justice Taney's opinion because there was now no doubt whatsoever that a person born, free or not, doesn't matter, is now a citizen of U.S. They can run for Congress, they can run for the House, right? They can do all things citizens can do, and citizens of the state. They get those privileges and immunities. Everyone with me? That's why this very first sentence, they put it right up front, Section 1, right at the front, was so significant. Okay. Any questions on that before I jump into the actual case? And did you all watch a little video on the case? Was that helpful? Yeah, the video I think actually maps make it a little bit easier. Oh, good news. My publisher, not for you, not that you're going to care, but our publisher approved another 32 videos for this year, which we're recording over the summer. Won't help any of you, unfortunately, but your classmates in the fall will be able to watch another 2-3 dozen videos and support their education. Okay. So let's go through the actual facts. I was in St. Louis about a week or two ago. I can't remember. And actually, I went to the courthouse where Dred Scott and Harriet Scott petitioned for their freedom. There's actually, I should have a picture to show it to you later. There's actually a statue of Dred Scott and his wife, like a very nice statue, and they actually named the street Dred Scott Place, right outside the courthouse, which I think is very fitting. Scott actually petitioned for his freedom there, and the jury, the trial, gave it to him, but that got reversed on appeal. And I actually went to the courtroom. It's been renovated, but I went to the courtroom where that hearing was held. Very cool exhibit. If you're ever in St. Louis, it's immediately across the street from the arch. You know that big, McDonald's thing, right? The big arch. It's right across the street, so you can't miss it. Okay, so this is Dred Scott. All right. So to understand Dred Scott, we have to do a little bit of American history, which I know law students hate. But I'll walk you through it. In the beginning, right, there were 13 colonies. At the time, there were other countries that still had territories on the American continent. You had England with their territories, you had Spain with some territories in the south, and then you had France. And France had what's called the Louisiana Territory. It's called Louisiana after King Louis, right? But it basically was like the entire region over here. It was a very big property, not just what's currently the state of Louisiana. And very early on in his presidency, Jefferson was confronted with a very significant choice. Jefferson had the opportunity to buy the entire Mississippi Territory, Louisiana Purchase it was called, from Napoleon. Napoleon was basically desperate for cash. He was fighting his wars in Europe. He did not want to deal with the Americas. He said, I'll give it to you for $15 million. And even back then, that was a very small amount for the huge territory. Now, at the time, only Congress had the power to purchase property, right? Pursuant to what's called the Property Clause. All right, no one ever talks about the Property Clause, but it's a very important clause. Where is it? Yeah.
15 million francs.
I'm sorry. Thank you so much.
I was like $15 million. That's huge.
I'm sorry. Abdul's correct. 15 million francs. Thank you so much for correcting me. So, at the time, Congress had the power to acquire property. That is, they could pass a statute, appropriate the money, and buy it. We cited this before, right? The president doesn't have the power to appropriate money. Only Congress does. Where did Jefferson get the $15 million to acquire? 15 million francs, thank you, Abdul. The 15 million francs to acquire it. Did he go to Congress? No, he didn't. He determined that there was an emergency. Congress wasn't available at the time to make this decision, and he did it by himself. And Jefferson had doubts if he had the power to extend the United States beyond its border. In fact, he thought you might even need a constitutional amendment to acquire this new territory. He just didn't know it hadn't been done before. But he thought that the purchase was so beneficial to the national interest that he did it. And he said a strict observance of the written law is doubtless one of the high duties of a good citizen, but is not the highest, Jefferson wrote. The laws of necessity, of self-preservation, of saving our country when in danger, are of a higher obligation. This is important. He said, to lose our country by a scrupulous adherence to the written law would be to lose the law itself, with life, liberty, and property, and all those who are enjoying them with us, thus absurdly sacrificing the ends to the means. This is a remarkable statement, right? He said it was so important to acquire this territory that the law of necessity, think of torts, right? Necessity doctrine. The law of necessity compels a loose adherence to the law, which is a good way of saying we're going to just ignore the statutes and the Constitution. Jefferson, right? This is only, 8 years after, I don't know, about 13 years after the Constitution was ratified. Everyone with me? But the acquisition of this new territory created a conflict. Would the new states be free or would they be slave? Why does this matter? Every state that was admitted as a free state would decrease the South's power. Every state admitted as a slave state would decrease the North's power. If you notice, almost all the early presidents, with the exception of John Adams, were all Southerners. And that was in large part because of the boost in the Electoral College by the Three-Fifths Compromise. They had more representation. So you had this sectional conflict, right? Where the northern states tended to be free, their agriculture didn't really demand it. And the southern states, which were primarily agricultural, demanded slaves. So Congress reached what became a compromise. What's called the Missouri Compromise of 1820. That's what this green line is. And the compromise was this. States above that green line would be admitted as free, with the exception of Missouri, which was slave. And states below that green line were admitted as slaves. And the idea was, if we just keep the country at equipoise, one slave, one free, one slave, it will just prevent conflict. This compromise was destined to fail, right? Because it just cemented the fact that the country was so divided. You can look at the map, it's right down the middle, right? It's right down the middle. Yes, Abdul?
I'm sorry, this is a dumb question, but does that green line go all the way to the Atlantic? So it includes Kentucky, Virginia? Or like,
Well, Kentucky were already admitted as slave.
so it's all stop there?
So the green line affected the territories, right? These were properties in the U.S. government's acquisition that were not yet states, right? So before you can become a state, you have to get a certain amount of population, you have to build a government, you have to do certain things. So for example, this case involved the Wisconsin territory, which involves present-day Minnesota. Wisconsin wasn't a state yet. Minnesota wasn't a state yet. Illinois was a state. So these, see these gray? California wasn't a state yet.
Otherwise, it's basically like Atlantic future.
Yeah, it was a westward expansion idea, right? But Kentucky and Virginia were already, in West Virginia, well, West Virginia's a little different, but didn't exist yet. West Virginia only came about after the Civil War. But Kentucky and Virginia were in a very different stage. You're with me so far, okay? So this Missouri Compromise was developed according to the Property Clause, which is a provision of the Constitution no one ever talks about. But it says the Congress shall have the power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting territory, right, or other property belonging to the United States. And they argued, well, we have the power to establish rules for the territories, and we'll say in this territory it's free, and in this territory it's slave. Okay? Not to ruin the surprise, but Chief Justice Taney, among many things that he did in the Dred Scott decision, invalidated the Missouri Compromise. This isn't in your book, but I want to explain this because it's very important, right? Chief Justice Taney invalidated the Missouri Compromise. Let me explain to you how he did it. And this is actually a good introduction to the case. Taney sought to resolve every conceivable objection to his opinion. The usual mode of judging is you try and resolve things on narrow grounds without reaching more difficult constitutional questions. You resolve it as narrowly as you can. But Taney said, aha, look at me, I'm so smart, right? Even if Dred Scott is not a citizen and he can't avail himself of diversity jurisdiction, someone else might be able to, right? There might be a suit from a state court which appeals to the Supreme Court. Everyone understand this, right? Even if Scott lost There might be another case down the road which involves state court where diversity is irrelevant. He wanted to stop this in its tracks. He did not want any possible claim of slavery coming back to the court. So he went out of his way to knock down every conceivable objection. And one of the most important things he knocked down was the Missouri Compromise. So, who am I up to? Is it Irma? I think you're next. Irma, so if I were just to tell you this provision was in the Constitution of 1787, right? It says, the Constitution shall have power to dispose of and make all needful rules, regulations respecting the territory or the property belonging to the United States. What territories does that provision give Congress the power to control? What territories are they talking about? Just territory, property belonging to the U.S. What are they talking about there? Okay, but where are these territories located? Let me show you again the map. Right, where are these territories located? Now, we know that Jefferson didn't acquire the Louisiana territories until 1803. The Constitution was not ratified till 1789. In 1789, did any of the framers think that we would own these territories in the middle? No. So then what does this phrase, territories belong to the United States? Does it mean the territories that belong to the U.S. in 1787? Or the territories that might be acquired in years later? What does that language mean, Irma? Oh. So what about newly acquired territories? Does Congress not have power over those? Oh. Everyone see what you just said, right? Tawney was not an idiot. He was a very smart lawyer. He was insane, right? The guy was nuts. His opinion here is it was so long and so winded that the reporter of the court wouldn't put all of it into the published opinion. He said, this is too much, it's too much, right? But he's a smart guy, right? He's not an idiot. Okay? But Irma just made a point. She said, look, belonging, that's a past tense, right? What territories belong? So what Tawney said, and this is an amazing holding, right? I don't mean amazing good. I mean like amazing, like stunning, right? A stunning holding, right? That Congress only had the power to regulate the territories in existence in 1787. Any newly acquired territories were not covered by that clause. Therefore, Congress could not prohibit slavery in newly acquired territories. Everyone just get the whole thing. I'll explain why it's wrong in a minute, right? But he said that because this only affects territories that were in existence in the United States in 1787, they couldn't acquire new ones. Now, this position isn't entirely insane. In fact, Jefferson, I said a minute ago, thought he might need an amendment to actually acquire new territories, right? There's some connection there, right? You know, Jefferson thought, Congress doesn't have the power over things that were in existence versus things that are new. Now, let me just explain. Now, I think I'll explain why I think that position is probably wrong, right? The Constitution expressly considers the admission of new states. It does. And usually the way it works is you'd have a territory, and once it gets a certain size, population, and a structure of government, it becomes a state. Could it really be the case that while a territory is forming, it has no government? The Congress has zero control over a territory until it achieves statehood. That's a really tough position to make, right? Belonging doesn't have to be past tense. It could be at the time. When is it belonging now, right? Or newly acquired territories. In other words, there's no reason why you have to read the property clause in the fashion Tawney did. But that he did so meant that all of this gray territory, going all the way out, right, could not be made free. That Congress lacked the power to make these great territories free soil. That was the impact, right? By saying that all newly acquired territories Congress has no power over, that means that they would all be by definition slave. Everyone see that? Taney's opinion went out of his way to strike down a massive political compromise that had been in existence for 30-something years at that point. Right? Yes, Raquel?
I'm sorry, can you clarify, are you saying that if Congress lacks the power to control its territories, then they are automatically slaves?
Yeah. If Congress lacks the power to pass rules and regulations for these territories, then they can't pass a rule providing it's free. In other words, the natural state is people can choose whether they have slaves or not, right? But Congress can't intervene to say at the outset, no slave is permitted, right? Congress can't, in other words, Raquel, let me answer the question differently. Congress can't prohibit slavery because they can't pass any rules for those territories. Does that make sense? Everyone Raquel put her question very well, right? Because Congress can't pass any rules, they can't pass a rule that prohibits slavery. Yeah, Damon?
But the Congress can't pass any rules for these states?
That's what Tawny held. Territories.
These territories or anything related to the problem?
Anything at all, right? Tawny says they can't pass any rules concerning the territories. Not just the property in the territories in general. See the or over here? They can't pass any rules concerning the territories. Yeah, Clint?
But this is, I hear what you're saying. It's disturbing to me. Maybe I misunderstood.
Disturbing. Okay, it's a strange opinion.
So belonging is a present participle of the word belong.
Yeah.
Indicating, as defined by modern English, the form of a verb ending in ing, which is used forming continuous tenses. So in other words, belonging would be a continuous tense from when the Constitution was ratified up until the day we're interpreted. And I understand that that's not the way that Tawny understood that, because I read his opinion. But there's no one had ever gone back and said that he was extremely wrong just based on the
grammar.
Understanding of English, or has it changed since 18?
So let me answer your question this way. The rules of grammar have not been constant in the last 200 years. So it's possible, I don't know the answer, but it's possible that participles weren't as strictly adhered to in the 1780s as they were today. This actually came up in a case called District of Columbia versus Heller. When I was a law student, I wrote an amicus brief on 18th century grammar and commas and the like. I didn't answer this question, but there's a lot of stuff on grammar books from the 1800s, which you're welcome to peruse. But the point is, even if it's open-ended, right, how we construe a dangling participle, whatever else, that reading was so at odds with how 50 years of history have progressed, right? That for 40-something years, 50 years, Congress had understood this clause to give them power to do something. And then Tawny comes and says, no, you're wrong. You want to talk about a gloss, right? Every branch of government said, you can do this. And Tawny said, no, because the text is a little bit, grammar, whatever, we'll limit it to only those in existence in the 1780s. It's a strange opinion, right? I think you're disturbing what words you use, right? But it's a very bizarre opinion.
I felt like it was something that he tried to change the meaning of a word. When I read this last night, I felt like he tries to change the meaning of many of the words.
He does, yeah.
Based on what, like the word cool. The word cool didn't mean what it means today.
Refer to temperature.
Yeah, temperature. You shouldn't say. I feel like he just said, "Oh, wait a minute. Well, the way that we hit people in the Supreme Court are using belonging nowadays, we can interpret it this way."
Okay. Yeah, I don't disagree with you. I think Clint makes a fair point, right? But I just want, this is my setup for the case, right? He goes out of his way to reach the most extreme holdings possible to get where he wants to go. Okay? So the first part of the holding, right, is the Missouri Compromise. I'm not going in order. I'm giving this in order that makes sense, not his opinion, which doesn't really make sense. But I'm just giving you the word that makes sense. The first part of the opinion, right, is that the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. It's an amazing opinion. The second part of the opinion is focused on the Fifth Amendment. Do I not have it up here? Okay. The Fifth Amendment, right? Sorry, I'll put it up here. Okay. So the Fifth Amendment provides that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So there are two ways, right? There are two perspectives by which Congress is disabled from regulating slavery in the free territories. One is the Territories Clause. You already knocked that out. But the second one is far more pernicious, far more evil, right? So who am I up to? Alexandra. What's the argument concerning the Fifth Amendment, just in slavery? Just broadly describe it for me, please.
Slaves were not, well, according to
Tony, yeah.
that they were non-slaves for the people
Well, Alexandra, I'm sorry. My sister's name is Alex, so I just say Alex instinctively. So if you prefer Alexandra, just correct me. With the Fifth Amendment, right? Who here is Tawny concerned about? Whose liberty is Tawny worried about when we're talking about the Fifth Amendment? Dred Scott's liberty? No. Whose liberty is he worried about? Is it Dred Scott's liberty? No. Who are we talking about? What's in Dred Scott v. Sandford? Whose liberty is Tawny worried about? Is he worried about Dred Scott's liberty? No. Who's he worried about? No, David. Dred Scott v. Sandford. This is not a hard question. Whose liberty is he worried about? Sandford. Thank you. Yeah, Sandford. It can be one or the other, right? Who's Sandford? The slave owner, right? So the second part, right? Again, I'm not going in order. These are the big pictures here. The second part of Dred Scott is focusing on the liberty of the slave owners. Okay. And this is the part that people was like what? Right? But this was not an argument. Do you hear that, Hannah?
Nope.
This is not an argument that Tawny made up. In fact, there's a reading in the chapter about Charles Pinckney, who's from South Carolina, and this argument developed for some years earlier. And the argument was this: the Fifth Amendment prohibits the federal government from depriving someone of their property or liberty without due process of law, and that if property is taken, compensation must be afforded. So the argument was this: if indeed slaves were property, if that was the case, then the federal government could deprive a person of their property without giving them due process of law. And if the property was deprived, the government must provide compensation. Right? So David, putting aside the Territories Clause argument for a minute, if Congress prohibited slavery in the territories, the Louisiana territories, and a slave owner moved to one of those territories, what would happen to his property interest? And would he be paid for it, compensated? Okay, so here was the argument that Tawney advanced. That for Congress to require the territories to be free soil, it will be depriving the slave owners of their property interests. They would get no hearing. They would get no process. It would simply be deprived by virtue of entering the state. And they would not be afforded compensation. So Tawney's second reason why these free territories couldn't work was because they ran afoul of the Fifth Amendment and that they amounted to a deprivation of property without due process of law. And there was no compensation afforded for the freedmen. Yeah, Kenny?
If they did take them, if they just said slaves are free and they gave them money, would that have made it okay in Islam? You're compensated for it?
Okay. So there are two issues, right? There are two clauses separated by a semicolon. There's the due process clause and the compensation clause. Generally, in order to take private property, say you live on a farm and they want to build a high-speed railroad through your farm, right? The government can take your property, but that's to do a hearing and a trial, right? That's called what's called a condemnation proceeding, right? So let's say that every person who brought a slave into Wisconsin was given a hearing to determine the value of the slave and there was compensation provided. That would not be enough for Tawney. Why? This phrase, due process of law, is one that you haven't been exposed to yet, but I'm going to give you a sneak peek now. The court and Tawney said that due process doesn't only mean procedure, right? A procedure. You get a hearing, a judge, etc. The due process of law also requires fairness. That the law must have a substantive component that must be fair. And what Tawney holds is such a law depriving a person of their property could never be fair. Right? Imagine at the checkpoint entering the territory, there was a judge saying, okay, let's have a hearing. Oh, you have a slave? That's nice. Take some money, let him go free, right? For Tawney, that would not be fair because the idea of depriving a person of their property by itself was a deprivation of their liberty interests, right? This is what became known as substantive due process. We'll spend an entire month on this. There's procedural due process, which refers to things like hearings and judges and the like. That's easy. But substantive due process is where liberty has a substance to it and that the law itself is unfair to deprive a person of their ownership of slaves. So what Tawney is basically doing is cutting off every path by which a slave could raise a claim of emancipation. Right? They couldn't go down the territory route because that was unconstitutional. They couldn't go down the due process route because it violated the slave owner's rights. See what he's doing? He again, crazy but smart, right? He had a very specific plan with his opinion. Now, oh yes, Gabriel.
I was just going to say, I mean, even if, assuming that the owners were going to get paid, just trying to come up with a price for the slave would be insane. And even if that was the case, I think Danny's point is like, depriving the fact that going forward, just in general, they're not going to have access to the property.
So the first part of your question, actually no. Calculating value was actually a business. I mean, I know it sounds gruesome by today's standards, but that actually wasn't the hardest part. There were books with prices. So that's not the harder part. The question then is, would you actually be able to afford someone a hearing and trial and the like? Right, but I don't mean to be glib, but if you go to the 14th Amendment, I don't have it up there, section I think section 3. Yeah, section 4, I'm sorry. It says, neither the United States nor any state shall assume or pay any debt, blah, 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 for any claim for the loss or emancipation of any slave. So basically, section 4 of the 14th Amendment, the very last sentence, explains that no debt shall be paid for the emancipation of any slaves. This was a legitimate concern, Gabe, because people thought that slavery would start bringing lawsuits saying, "Where's my money?" So the 14th Amendment nullified those, wiped those out.
That would be a lot of money.
It would. I actually looked at the amount once. It was an insane. It was an insane amount of money, and no, they did put a price on it, right? Because someone acquired a slave for X. Oh, here, depreciation. I'm trying not to be glib here, but this was a business. The same way you buy livestock at a rodeo, right? You ever go to the rodeo where they have the auctions? Yeah, it's gruesome. In fact, I mentioned the Dred Scott Courthouse. There's a plaque and it said, "This was the site where slaves were sold, right in front of the courthouse," and now it's named after Dred Scott, the actual street. If you're ever in St. Louis, just take 5 minutes and walk by there. It's pretty moving, but a very nice exhibit inside. But everyone with me, right? Now, the crazy part, right, about this Fifth Amendment argument, the absolutely nuts part, the absolutely crazy part, why wouldn't the slaves be protected by the Due Process Clause? They are persons. The Fifth Amendment doesn't apply to citizens. It applies to persons. And we said this, I think this was Cameron's question earlier. The person's bound to labor, no doubt. But the persons, right? Why couldn't you say a slave can't be deprived of his liberty without due process of law? Right? This was Lysander Spooner and some of the other abolitionists, which you read about in your reading. Frederick Douglass, among others. Right? Why couldn't the slaves themselves be entitled to this liberty? They're described as persons in the Constitution, persons held to labor. They describe them as such persons in the Fugitive Migration Clause, right? They're persons. Why can't these persons get due process of law? Because if they get due process of law, how can you have slavery? You're being deprived of your liberty completely arbitrarily. Right, that's what Frederick Douglass, one of the most prominent abolitionists, argued. He argued this until the day he died, right? That the original Constitution did not allow slavery. That it existed was only in violation of the Constitution itself. Everyone with me so far? Right? Yeah, Kevin?
I'm going to harp on this point, but when it says persons, I mean, is that assuming, like, I don't know how else to really put this, like a whole person? Because even though slaves were considered 3/5 of a person?
Well, but just be precise. For purpose of representation, they were only counted 3/5, but the actual person wasn't 3/5.
Okay.
But I think your question is, when they're saying such persons, they don't actually mean persons, right? They mean slaves. But this was Frederick Douglass's argument. They didn't use that language. And there's a consequence for not using that language. The consequence for being vague and saying persons. Because if the Fifth Amendment applies to persons, and they're called persons, hell, why don't they get due process of law? Now, the response, I'll just say second, Raquel. The response is, look, if you're rounding someone up in a boat, they're not getting much liberty there, right? So this is I think Jonathan's point earlier. Even if the text can be read this way, the intent would likely cut the other way. Yes, Raquel?
In the text, it talks about the discussion of the Fifth Amendment before the case, right? It says that in 1837, the gentlemen or an abolitionist are fighting for this estate, and it applies to enslaved
Yeah.
people. So it's safe to say that Connie knew about
He knew.
this, and then
Ignored it.
decided to write.
Yeah, he chose sides, right, Raquel? He chose sides. He picked the Pinckney argument, but not the Frederick Douglass argument. He chose sides, right? And that's probably what drove the Garrisonians so nuts about this, because they've been arguing for decades that the Constitution is a pro-slavery document, and then Tawney adopts their argument. And you have Frederick Douglass saying, "No, you idiot! Look, Fifth Amendment, persons, liberty, right? Why don't we get it too?" But Tawney doesn't even acknowledge that point. I'll explain why in a minute. Okay, but everyone just get the point, right? You got the Territories Clause, you got the Due Process Clause. Everyone right. Okay. Now let me answer Raquel's question. I think it's a good segue to my next topic. There's a very long excerpt in your book about why people of African descent, free or slave, are inferior. right? It's a long excerpt. They say, Josh, I get it, right? Right? He thinks black people are inferior. I get it, right? Why are you giving such a long excerpt? The reason why is actually the answer to Raquel's question. Tawney needs to establish that the people of African descent are inferior. Why? To respond to Frederick Douglass. That they're not persons entitled to liberty because they never were. Everyone see that point, right? Raquel asked me, why doesn't Tawney acknowledge the Frederick Douglass position? He dances around it, right? But his point is this. Because these people are inferior, the unfortunate, right? The unfortunate race, right? He uses such extreme language at length to say that they cannot get the privileges and immunities of citizenship. That they cannot get liberty, right? That these unfortunate people, and I don't use these words lightly, we put these in the book for a reason, that these individuals cannot get it. Whether free or slave. That's the important point, right? So far we've been talking just about slaves. But what he says is it makes no difference, right? It makes no difference whether they're free or slave because of their very nature. They are inferior and they cannot get these rights. Okay? Now, the harder question, right? Why did he have to do this? Why did he need to establish this inferiority? Even if he says Native Americans are better off, right? Why does he have to do this? Any other questions first we move on? I think I saw a hand float. Right? Raquel, does that kind of get at your question?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I know it's getting there. Right? I do it in this order because I think it makes a little bit more sense because the order he does it is almost backwards. Yeah, Gabe?
Yeah, just adding to the code, he actually said detailed stipulation was fixed upon the whole rate.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said. Say it again, please.
It says the detailed degradation.
Oh, degradation.
Fixed upon the whole race.
Yeah, that basically the entire race is cursed, basically, right? That they can never. Now, why does he make such a big deal about this? Yeah, Carlos.
Just suffering, I think because the way the Constitution is drafted, they're very specific whenever they mean citizens and whenever they mean persons. Because they were trying to establish universal rights to any human being per se, and rights to persons that actually belong to the country. And they're trying to make that difference.
Very, yeah.
He wanted to try to prove that they were not even persons.
Bingo. Yeah. I think Carlos said it very well. He has two missions here. To show that they're not citizens, which is why the diversity holding is what it is, but also they're not persons. Because citizens get the privileges and immunities, right, under Article 4. If you're a citizen, you get these privileges and immunities. So they can't have that. But Carlos says one step further. They can't be given personhood because to have personhood would to give them liberty under the Due Process Clause. And that cannot stand either. Right? This is why he goes on and on and on and on and on about this unfortunate race and how they're, degradation. I think Gabe said that a minute ago, right? That's why he has to bury this so deeply. Right? Now, Robert, let me ask you the question I was asking a minute ago. Where does the institution of slavery come from? Where does it originate from? How does slavery begin?
Well, it's from Thirteenth laws, I think, on territory.
Okay, that's true as a historical matter, but does do you need to pass a statute to have slavery under Tawney's view? No. So what about in states like New York or Maine or whatever that eliminated slavery? Does Tawney think that actually changes the status of people of African descent?
Not from the federal government?
No.
No?
To Tawney, say like Maine or New Hampshire or Massachusetts emancipates slavery. So we abolish slavery, people of African descent can vote, hold office, etc. Does Tawney think that has any impact?
No, because the Senate talks about it.
You're right. I'm gonna get to this later. Let's just stick with Tawney for a minute. Okay, you're jumping ahead very well. But does Tawney think that matters? Okay, he's right. The reason why Tawney has to go through all these lengths to explain why these people are inferior, and I mean these really, really egregious passages, right, is precisely because he wants to discard the states that have abolished slavery and say that these states aren't doing anything, right? Whatever they're bestowing on these people is probably a mistake, he says, right? But they're doing it only as a matter of state law. And they can't bestow upon them any actual meaningful citizenship. And again, look at the clause, right? Look what the clause says. Citizens of each state. It doesn't speak of federal citizenship. What he's saying is the African people are incapable of being citizens of any kind, period. He says Native Americans can become citizens if they're so naturalized, but people of African descent can never be citizens of a state. Even if a state calls them a citizen, it's not really that because these people are incapable of it, right? And I don't want to use the phrase before, but like, imagine if a state starts granting citizenship to animals. Right? That's basically what he's saying. These people are inferior, and they're not capable of it. He needs to get there to say that they cannot have these privileges and immunities of citizenship, right? That's the core of the holding, that whatever law a state has is irrelevant on this question. Yeah?
Why was Tommy so preserving slavery?
Yeah, if you heard his question, he says, why was Tawney so set on preserving slavery? It's a very good question. Again, go back to our map, right? I showed you this map a little bit earlier. Tawney, this one's a little bit animated. Tawney recognized that the United States could not survive as a nation divided. In fact, Lincoln actually agreed, right? A house divided cannot stand. It would be either all slave or all free. You couldn't have this middle ground where someone traveled from one state to another and the slave became free or not, right? So Lincoln said the solution is to make it all free, kind of. Tawney said the opposite. He said the solution is to make it all slave. And he thought that by writing this opinion, which we're spending 2 hours on, right? That by writing this opinion, he, Roger Tawney, would end the compromise. He would end the debate. Because once the Supreme Court spoke, that was it. How wrong he was. 1 second, Samuel. Let me mention this point. I'll get to it in a minute, I promise. The importance of Dred Scott was only a court decision, but became political. The backlash to Scott was so strong. The Republican Party was more or less formed as an abolition party. And Abraham Lincoln came to national prominence arguing against Dred Scott. And here is Lincoln's argument, which was very, very precise. Now people say, oh, Lincoln said we should ignore the Supreme Court. No, he didn't say that. Now, let's be very precise here what Lincoln said. He had a case, Dred Scott v. Sandford, right? Dred Scott v. Sandford. Who were the parties to that case? You had Dred Scott and then Mr. Sandford. Was the United States government a party to that case? No, it was not. Was Congress a party to the case? No, Congress wasn't. So what Lincoln argued is that a court's judgment can only be binding on the parties before the court. This is res judicata, right? Collateral estoppel. You learn about this in Civ Pro. That's generally not a controversial idea except when you get to the Supreme Court. Because the Supreme Court has said that we are the Supreme Court, right? And we declare the law for everyone. And Lincoln said, no. I, as president, the president was not party to that case. I'm not bound by it. Because guess what? Even after Tawney struck down the Missouri Compromise, Congress kept legislating in the territories. You can be damn sure they did. They didn't really follow along. So Lincoln said, look, we're not bound by this judgment. Now you may be saying, go Lincoln, right? Go Lincoln, right? Lincoln's right. I have to flip it on you. Brown v. Board of Education, right? Who's Brown? She was a student in Topeka, Kansas. What was the Board of Education? It was Topeka Board of Education. It involved 4 states. It was Kansas, South Carolina, Delaware, and Virginia. Check me on that. I think I'm right. Okay. Was Arkansas party to the Brown litigation? No, it was not. Was Little Rock party to Brown? No, it was not. So after Brown was decided, was Little Rock School District required to desegregate? Well, under the Tawney view, yeah, everyone's instantly bound by the Supreme Court's judgments. Ironically, the Little Rock School Board and the governor of Arkansas, Wolf Office, said, no, we're with Lincoln, right? We're with Lincoln. Irony, right? We're with Lincoln. We're not bound by Brown v. Board, so we're not going to desegregate our schools. In other words, sue us, right? Get a judgment against us. And this creates a game of whack-a-mole. You ever notice that whack-a-mole is over at the carnival, you bang one, the other one pops up? So check this out, right? African-American students in Little Rock sued the school board. Okay, school board bound by judgment, okay, we'll desegregate, right? Then the police show up, the Little Rock police say, no, we're not going to let any black students to the school, it's too dangerous. So they get a judgment against the police department. Okay, police department disperses, the Arkansas State National Guard show up. You got to sue them also. Death by 1,000 cuts, one litigation after another. But this is Lincoln's argument, right? So I always give the students, if you like Lincoln, cool. But the segregationists, the irony, right? The segregationists made very similar arguments about the scope of the judgment. They said, Dred Scott didn't bond everyone. Neither did Brown v. Board. Whoa. And Samuel, then Clinton. Actually, let me do you first, I'll come back. Okay, Clinton, go ahead.
So that's fairly simple. Dred Scott didn't matter, period. What was you said this last time. What was the judgment of Dred Scott?
You tell me.
No,
I remember, what did I say?
you said that.
Oh, okay, yeah. So
Jurisdiction.
yeah, I didn't even get to the jurisdiction. I'm doing maybe a different order than the last one, right? The ultimate holding of Dred Scott, right?
So Lincoln didn't prove anything. There's no jurisdiction. This is not a case.
It's a 200-page dictum.
It's 200 pages of, dictum's a good word.
Yeah.
Better word than what I had.
I try to be more judicious than Clinton,
Better
but
word than what I had.
But let me explain. I'll get to Samuel in a minute. But let me do Clinton's question, right? The basis of this case, right? I gave you the big stuff first. First, you have the territory clause. Then you have the due process clause, right? But the introductory issue, was this case properly before federal court? Sandford, not Sandford, it's Sandford. There's a typo in the reporter. Sandford was a citizen of New York. Mr. Dred Scott said, aha, I am a citizen of Missouri. Diversity, jurisdiction, right? You can sue a diverse party in federal court. Why was he in federal court? Because he sued before in state court and it didn't work. Remember I told you he brought a lawsuit in the Missouri trial court, right in St. Louis. The trial court ruled for his favor, for him and Harry, his wife. Right, he actually was emancipated. The Missouri Supreme Court reversed it on appeal. And in doing so, the Missouri Supreme Court reversed it on precedent. Because under the laws of the state beforehand, a slave who went to a free state could be emancipated, or free territory, as it were. Okay? So he tried again. He didn't appeal that judgment to the U.S. Supreme Court. He said, okay, I'll start over again. Went to federal court. The ultimate holding of the case, the black letter holding, is that Dred Scott was not a citizen, therefore he could not avail himself of diversity jurisdiction. And as Clinton said, I think correctly, dismissed for lack of jurisdiction. This was the longest case in the world when it could have been one sentence, right? Maybe a paragraph, but maybe a page, right? One page, I can write in my sleep, right? The court holds that Dred Scott is not a citizen, therefore he cannot use diversity jurisdiction. Case dismissed, period, end of sentence. That's it. But the insanity of Tawney is that he wanted to hit these other points about the Missouri Compromise and the Due Process Clause and the Privileges and Immunities Clause, right? He wanted each and every one of these arguments to resolve slavery. This was a question asked a minute ago, right? Why? He wanted to settle this issue. Because even if Dred Scott didn't have diversity jurisdiction, someone else would, right? Someone else would come from state court where there might be jurisdiction. And that would be the case he'd have to resolve. So he said, screw this. Let's just forget this jurisdictional stuff. But Clinton's right. You had a 200-something page dictum. The entire opinion is irrelevant. So is Lincoln actually ignoring anything, right? Once the court holds it says no jurisdiction, is there any holding to actually follow? Tawny thought so. Gabe.
So do you think just to make this argument as strong as possible, he put the Indians there, basically saying,
Yeah.
show that
Even the
they're
Indians.
civilized and they don't compare to them because they were independent and they had no law.
Yeah, I think, and I didn't forget what you, Samuel. I didn't forget you. Those questions I'll go back to you. I'm sorry. I think Gabriel raises a fair point, right? He says, look, the Indians weren't brought here in chains, right? They were here before the white man was here. So they are of a higher status, and they can be absorbed into the body politic in ways that the African slaves. I think this is one line that says, not a single African came here on his own free volition. I don't know if that's true. I can't imagine that's true. But anyway, he said there are lots of lies. There are lots of things that simply are false. But he says that in the opinion. Samuel, you have all the time. I'm sorry, I've been keeping you on hold for. I feel like I'm a text part, right? Your call is very important to us. It's maybe recorded for quality assurance. Indeed. Please reboot. No.
Yeah. Do you think that James Buchanan and James Conley were like acting in congruence here? Because I think Buchanan inaugurated during this decision or somewhere. His like, message to the American people were that we're going to fix this slavery issue because, it could be, can't be all free, or it has to be all free or all slaves.
Yeah.
Slaves. So,
yeah.
All right, Connie, this court better get it right here.
Yeah, so everyone understands Samuel's question. So James Buchanan was the president before Lincoln. And he is usually ranked as one of the worst presidents of all time. These current rankings are silly, but he actually did really bad stuff. And he ushered us into a civil war in ways that took a long time to heal, if ever. I think Tawney hitched his wagon to the Buchanan position, that right? You can't have divided either all slave or all free. Let's go with all slave. I think that was the wagon Tawney hitched himself on. Yeah, Bill.
He was president from Maryland.
Well, Maryland was a slave state.
It was a slave state.
Big time, yeah. In fact, Maryland was one of the so-called border states, like Kentucky, where even though they were part of the Union, they were very much pro-slavery. Even remember Ex parte Merryman, right? Ex parte Merryman was involving rebels in the state of Maryland who were held by Fort McHenry. John Wilkes Booth, who killed Lincoln, was a Marylander.
Maryland fight with the North?
Barely. They fought with the North, but the people were very sympathetic to the South. It was Lincoln viewed the border states as these very special places. In fact, the border states, one more second, Abdul, the border states were not subject to the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln did not free the slaves in Maryland. Lincoln did not free the slaves in Kentucky either. Because he said Maryland is so important, it's right there, geographic, right by Virginia. We can't rock the boat there. Make sense?
Growing up, we were taught that D.C. was carved out of Maryland and Virginia.
That's right.
Because it was like North and South, right in the middle.
Yeah.
I just assumed all along that it was slave and not slave.
My friend, so you ever hear the Mason-Dixon line, right? It's the line between, it's right here, you can see it, between Maryland and Pennsylvania. That was the line. You had the runaway slaves. Prig, right? Prig. The slave ran from Maryland to Pennsylvania. Right? In fact, if you're ever driving north, I've done this trip 100 times, from Maryland to Pennsylvania, there's a sign saying you're now crossing the Mason-Dixon line, right? You're welcome to Mason, right? The Masons, right? Welcome to freedom. When you're going south, the other way, there's no sign. Maryland's not too proud of that. But yeah, Maryland was a very big slave state. And Tawney himself was a slave owner as well. I think he eventually sold his slaves, but he was very much favoring the institution. Yeah, Laura?
You said Chief Justice Tawney wrote this opinion just in case somebody else, or the court had jurisdiction over somebody else. So, like, if he's saying, clearly people of African descent are not citizens, so how can the court?
State court.
Okay.
So, what if a state court ruled that the slave was emancipated? Then you don't have the federal question jurisdiction. Then it's merely appealing as a matter of from the state's highest court to the U.S. Supreme Court.
So that's what he was thinking.
Yeah, there was another case. I'm drawing a blank on the name. Was it Lemon? I'm drawing a blank. There was another case bubbling up which they were aware of. So if it wasn't this case, it'd be something else. Yeah.
Just briefly, why did their Supreme Court reverse the precedent?
You tell me.
preserve slavery?
Yep. It was actually, I didn't know this, it was only a 3-judge panel. The Missouri Supreme Court was a 3-judge panel, and I think there was 1 dissent. But the 2 in the majority reversed their own precedent as a means of holding that no one who leaves Missouri could ever become free. Yeah, I think that's the right answer. This isn't in your book, but at the very end, Tawny says, yes, and even if, because Dred Scott traveled to 2 places with his wife, right? He traveled to Fort Snelling, which is in modern-day Minneapolis, right? If you ever go to the Minneapolis airport, by the way, Fort Snelling is about a mile away. I was so mad. I went to speak at somewhere in Minnesota, and I didn't know this, so I went back to the airport. Like, no, it's here. I didn't have time to go. I was very mad. If you ever go to Minneapolis, it's right by the airport. But he also went to Illinois, right? Illinois is a free territory. I'm sorry, free state, not a territory. And Illinois abolished slavery, right? Why didn't Dred Scott become free by going to Illinois? Tawney says, Missouri law. Missouri law says he's not free, therefore he deferred to state law there. That was the significance of the Missouri Supreme Court's decision. Under state law, he did not become emancipated by virtue of going to a free state. So he didn't become free by going to a free territory, and he didn't become free by going to a free state. Guy was screwed. He could not be freed by traveling anywhere. As it turns out, and there was a very nice exhibit at the museum for Scott, he eventually was able to buy his freedom, right? Sandford, I didn't know this, became the phrase is imbecile, it's not the right phrase, but he got committed to a home for basically being crazy, and he died, check me on this, maybe a month or 2 after Dred Scott was decided. It was very close in time. And then eventually, Irene Sandford remarried an abolitionist. He was from, I think, Massachusetts. He was a doctor, very, very, very good guy. And he basically demanded you can't keep this, right? And so eventually, I'm sorry?
I thought he was the one that paid that.
Yeah. So eventually, Scott was sold off and he was freed. His bounty was freed. It took a while. And I think Scott died within a year or 2 after the decision. He didn't live after he was emancipated. He didn't live very long to see it. I think Harriet did. She was a remarkable woman. They actually had an entire exhibit on how she kept things in order. It was very, very impressive while the entire process was ongoing. All right? Yeah, Ashley.
I read in the book that it said that he tried to buy his freedom from her, and she married an abolitionist, and obviously supported his
Later. Well, so this is actually funny. I didn't know this. In the museum, it said apparently Irene never told her abolitionist husband about her slaves. She apparently kept that secret. She was a widower, right? You know, it's like on your dating profile, you don't put everything there. You have a dog, you might have put that in your profile. She didn't mention she had slaves. I don't know, but there was a thing on the museum that said that apparently he didn't know about her slaves until after the marriage. And I think at that point, that's when it blew up. That's why I had some of their Trey. Yes. Yeah, I mean, basically the upshot of the Tawney opinion is it doesn't matter what Congress says because the natural state is slave, right? Because Congress can't prohibit slavery, the natural state is allowing slavery because it's a property right.
But the state itself is not decided by...
Right, so Tawney didn't hold that Illinois lacks the power to abolish slavery. Why? Because Illinois wasn't bound by the Fifth Amendment. What he basically held is the southern states can pass a rule to deny their emancipation if they travel. So basically, Missouri could shield their slaves from emancipation wherever they go. So in other words, if a slave was purchased in Missouri and Illinois tried to free it, then the Missouri courts say, no, that doesn't work. So they could basically bring slaves to all 50 states. Let me say this differently, right? If a slave was purchased in a slave state, no other state could free that person by virtue of emancipation. Wood.
I was just curious, when I was reading the parts of his opinion that were invalidating the Missouri Compromise, I kept expecting him to talk about the Commerce Clause and necessary and proper and the holding in prig, which the dissent did, but they never went in that direction. And I just didn't, to me, I would think that Congress would have that authority because even under Tawny's rationale that they're property, why wouldn't they have the authority to regulate interstate commerce on that?
So, Witt's question is this, right? We know from Prigg that Congress has the power to enact a fugitive slave clause, right? That is, if there's a runaway slave, Congress can ensure the person is returned. He's like, well, why can't, actually it wasn't Congress was necessarily proper, but why can't Congress use its powers to eliminate slavery, right?
Or even just in the new territories.
So in other words, could Congress have said that we consider people moving from state A to state B are commerce, and we will determine how they can be regulated? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, in the new territories that are getting added, not in the
Commerce at that point didn't have such a broad sweep. It referred to the exchange of goods. Now Whit might say, well, isn't selling slavery interstate commerce? Maybe. Yeah, I mean, perhaps you could wing that. Commerce clause didn't have a lot of meaning, but maybe you could do it like that. Yeah, how do you think about that? Yes, Harmony?
We mentioned earlier that Tawny basically chose a side, and I guess going forward, history shows that he chose the wrong side.
He chose poorly. Yeah.
Is that what they mean by saying that it was a self-inflicted wound, or what does that mean when they?
Who said? Did I say that? Was that in the book?
No, I did my own research and I saw that, and I didn't know what it meant.
I don't either. But I'll try to guess. How's things go? Crap, did I say that in the book? I don't remember. It's a long reading.
I think you should have left reading with us.
Did I? Oh, okay. Then maybe I did. I don't remember what I said yesterday. To try and whatever strikes me. But yeah, I mean, he didn't have to do this. Maybe that's what I meant self-inflicted, right? He didn't have to do this. If he just hold, like Whit, Clinton said, right? Lack of diversity jurisdiction, dismissed, case over. No one would bat an eye, right? No one even cared. But he chose a side. And he decided that he wanted to make this decision solid. And to this day, Tawny is viewed in a horrible light. You have cities in Maryland and Frederick, his hometown, taking down statues of him, right? And people vandalizing Tawny statues. On the Maryland State Capitol grounds in Annapolis, they removed the Tawny statue. So he set his die. And he had other opinions that were actually very important, ex parte merriment, among others. He had some pretty significant decisions. But this is the one that has solidified his legacy. I mean, if I tell most people in the streets, oh yeah, Justice McLean's dissent, who the hell is Justice McLean, right? Curtis, who's Justice Curtis? Tawny, oh my God, Tawny, right? Like everyone, even non-lawyers know that name because of this decision, right? They know that name. Yeah, Laura and then Sam?
So Tawny knew, again, like he took sides. Wouldn't he anticipate like Congress amending these amendments eventually? So like it's kind of irrelevant that he.
You know, it's yeah. I mean, Laura's point is this, right? Wouldn't you know that Congress would try to amend it? Well, let me answer this question: if the court held that they lacked the power under the property clause, what can they amend? In other words, if the court actually followed Tawny's ruling, the entire gray, right? They'd be disabled. Say, all right, do whatever you guys want.
But isn't that what Congress did eventually for the 13th, 14th, and 15th?
Well, those are amendments to the Constitution, not statutes. Were there any doubt about Congress's powers? An amendment adds to it. Sam?
Couldn't Congress have the same effect as the Missouri Compromise just by refusing to admit a state that allows slavery?
Yeah, they could. They could just deny statehood. But that would be a very strange thing. We have all this westward expansion with lots of people in not states. You wanted to have that part of the union. So yeah, they could do that.
One thing, I mean, people wanted to be incorporated into a state. So, I mean,
now let me just flip the question on you. The southern states have a vote also, and they could outvote the northern states. So even if the northern states want to deny statehood to, New Mexico, whatever, right? The southern states could vote for it. Let's do the dissents. Who am I up to? Shivani. Let's go to Justice McLean's dissent, please. Again, the vote was 7-2. There were a lot of other concurring opinions, which I'm not going to bore you with, but they tried to state the issue a lot more narrowly. Let's just do the Justice McLean's dissent, please, Shivani. What was McLean saying? Please talk a little bit louder. I'm having trouble hearing.
Sorry, you said there's no injustice. she was asked for exercising jurisdiction. And he was saying that he prefers medicine and fairness from the JD's point of view rather than looking back at her history. He also talked about how the white women were used and so like slavery medicine, slavery and powder.
Well, thank you, Shivani. So let's say this about the dissent, right? About the dissent. He first rejects this insane notion that the property clause only applies to property that existed at the time of the framing. He says that's nuts. Okay? And that the Congress can make the needful regulations. He then makes another point that a Missouri slave owner doesn't carry the laws of Missouri with him when he goes into the territory. And we have this general notion of federal supremacy, right? That if you have a state law, you have a federal law, and they're in conflict, that the federal law takes precedence. And if Congress determines that there is no slavery in these territories, then that's the answer. By the same token, when a slave owner brings a slave to Illinois, a free state, you can't bring your laws with you. And the Illinois court would then have the power to emancipate him under Illinois law. But then, what about the Fugitive Slave Act? Right, Prig. Now, the original Fugitive Slave Act was enacted in 1793. There was another one enacted in 1850. So if actually, in fact, the slave ran away in Illinois and tried to seek his freedom under the Fugitive Slave Act, he returned. So this is not a lock solid argument from Justice McLean because of Prig. McLean also faults the Missouri Supreme Court, I think it was Evans' question, why they disregard their own law, right? Why they change their precedent. And I think the answer is to bolster slavery, and there's not much more to it than that. So any questions on the McLean dissent? Again, only 2 dissenting votes. Yeah, Stephanie, go ahead.
One thing that stuck out to me in the dissent was how he kind of referred to slavery as like a status or like an institution, that it wasn't, that it kind of existed over here and anybody could be subject to it.
A little bit more. I'm not sure where you're going either, but I want to follow along.
I lost it.
I'll call him Raquel. If it comes back, raise your hand, okay? Raquel.
Can you explain again how his Prig's argument wasn't safer?
So the argument's this, right? That an Illinois slave owner, a Missouri slave owner, when he brings his slave to Illinois, doesn't bring Missouri law with him, right? So in theory, a Missouri court could emancipate a slave under Missouri law. But we know from Prig that federal law does answer this question. And under federal law, state judges are bound to help return slaves to their masters. See where I'm going with this, right? So even if a Missouri person can't bring Missouri law with him to Illinois, he does bring with him federal law, which was the Fugitive Slave Act. So there's a little tension there. He actually discusses Prig and explains it. I think he probably thinks Prig was wrong, but you know, it was the law for 10 or 15 years at that point. Stephanie, you remember it? Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Jonathan?
I like how he just commented on the whole majority opinion, saying it's a matter of taste and of law. I think that was backhanded.
Yeah, there's some shade being thrown,
But
right?
he also brought up the point that they've made citizens of all grades and combinations of colors, and I felt like Tawny spent like a good 3 or 4 pages just talking about mixed races and how they never.
Yeah. Let me focus on that for a minute, right? Yeah, Jonathan. Why do you think Tawny spent so much time talking about mixed race people? Why do you think he had to about intermarriage, if you're this. Why didn't you get to spend so much time on that?
To address whether they were citizens either.
Yeah, his point, and he tries. The excerpt in your book is so long, very deliberately, to show you this point. He's trying to say that this is a race of people, even if they intermarry, they basically pollute, right? That they degrade, right? This degradation of people, so that even the mixed race people don't fall into this umbrella. That there must be this strict separation, that they can't even interbreed. We'll do a case in a couple weeks called Loving versus Virginia, which concerns bans. Please still work. Good. Bans and interracial marriage. Wait, this room is carpeted. Someplace I drop my phone, it goes splat. Okay. Yeah, what?
In both of the dissenting opinions,
And we'll get to Curtis in a minute, but go ahead.
they talk about defining the institution of slavery as this municipal ordinance or law. And I was just curious, are they trying to say that it's inherently a police power when they say that? Like, is that what a municipal law is, or is that?
Right. So I asked this question a while ago. Where does slavery come from? Right? This idea of municipal law means you only have slavery to the extent the state allows it to exist. Right? Texas, Virginia, Kentucky, whatever. They have to pass a statute permitting slavery. That's the perspective. The other perspective is that there's no statute that needs to be passed. That as a matter of natural law, there's this inferiority of the races, which lends itself to certain people being owned. That's, again, Tawny's argument that this interracial marriage, everything, that these people, by virtue of their uncivilized nature, they can't be anything but slaves. That it's a natural way of life to have this distinction between the peoples. So I think, Whit, your question is good because it highlights the fact that the majority in dissent don't even agree what slavery is, right? The dissent says slavery exists only because of positive law, statutes, which means it can be eliminated. Tawny's like, no, this can never be eliminated no matter what Congress says. He's trying to constitutionalize slavery. In fact, we know the 13th Amendment eradicates slavery, but there's another proposed 13th Amendment called the Corwin Amendment, Corwin, which would have said the Constitution protects the right to slavery. It was actually a proposed amendment that would have written slavery into the Constitution. It didn't go very far. But they actually were so intent on having slavery as a natural right that cannot be violated, they considered amending the Constitution to protect that. Indeed, the 13th Amendment does the exact opposite.
Question focuses more on the territories aspect. Does the U.S. Constitution apply to the territories at that point?
Well, Tawny says it did. Well, Tawny says the property clause doesn't. I'm not going to go into the other provisions, but he says the property clause doesn't.
And then moving on to today's territories in the Caribbean, I think they're fully under the U.S. Constitution.
They're not, actually. This was my exam question a couple of years ago. Believe it or not, if you're born in Guam or American Samoa, you are not a natural-born citizen by virtue of the 14th Amendment. You're a citizen by statute, that is, Congress passes a statute, but you're not a citizen by virtue of the Constitution. So if you're born in American Samoa, you cannot be president. Okay? Why? There were a series of cases from the 1800s and early 1900s called the Insular cases, which more or less said that these places are savage, they're uncivilized, and they're not entitled to the full protection of the Constitution. It was very much in keeping with Dred Scott. And the people of these nations are basically wards of the United States. They're not of the same stock. So to answer your question, I think it's a good question. These other federal territories do not have all the same rights. Now, they're given the rights by statute, right? That by statute, Congress has extended the Bill of Rights there, that you can't, violate speech, whatever. But it's by statute, not by the Constitution itself.
Well, I thought Puerto Rico got a study in 1917 to the that.
Huh?
That's how.
Yeah. Puerto Rico the same. Yeah. If you're born in Puerto Rico, you're a citizen by birth, but by statute, not by the 14th Amendment. Very good. Make sense?
Yeah.
I saw another hand, Cameron.
One thing I found interesting about Justice McCartney, and one of the nice to kind of elaborate on that, I thought was a good point. One thing you pointed out how this, being municipal and It's not a right. It's just, if you look in history, white men have been slaves before. This isn't, he puts all slavery as towards power, and it's against right, not an actual right. It's about who has the power.
Okay, I'll get to the point in a minute. Is there another hand somewhere floating? Yes, Sam.
Tony's reasoning, wouldn't the Fugitive Slave Act not apply to the territories? Like, a person wouldn't be obliged to return a slave?
Yeah, so Sam's question is, would the Fugitive Slave Clause even apply to the territories? Probably not, although he didn't reach that. Yeah. Okay. But let's go to Justice Curtis's dissent. I think it picks up on Cameron's point. Damon, as a historical matter, is Tawney correct that people of African descent were never treated as citizens in the United States? Is that correct as a historical matter?
No, Justice Curtis says that at the time that the Constitution was ratified, 5 states were African descent and could be citizens of 5 states.
Very good. Yeah, Damon's exactly correct. Right? At the time of the ratification, free-born people of African descent in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, and even North Carolina were citizens with equal terms. They could vote. They couldn't intermarry, though. Tawney makes that point emphatically clear. But they were allowed to vote and were given equal rights. So as a historical matter, Tawney is simply wrong, right? But what does that say about the text? We have the 3/5 clause, right? And in a rebuttal, he says the Constitution was not made exclusively for the white race. It says we the people. Now, how can you say we the people when you have this 3/5 clause? So there, you might like the Curtis dissent, but there's still a tension there where he has to dance around how things were and focus on the text itself. Again, you focus on the text it's meaning, or you can focus on the intentions behind it. Okay. All right. What else? And he does raise the Fifth Amendment argument. He says, look, Tawney is going up and up and up at the Fifth Amendment and the property rights of the slave owners. What about the liberty interests of the people themselves, right? Why can't we protect the rights of the slaves? Okay. But the dissents were fairly short, and they didn't nearly come close to hitting every single point. It's not for lack of editing. They didn't engage it. But these were very bitter dissents. And in fact, there was a concurring opinion by Justice Nelson, which is not in your book, was originally the majority opinion, but Tawney was able to flip the majority. Okay. All right, so questions on... Hey, Gabriel.
I just think he makes a good point, saying that no one in the Constitution makes a general citizenship.
Good, yeah. So again, this was my question at the very beginning of class, right? Does the Constitution define citizenship? And he says it does not. In other words, Tawney's holding is not compelled by the Constitution at all, right? Yeah, the Curtis dissent I think is a little better than the McLean dissent. It hits a little bit sharper. But he says this is not a Constitution made for the white race. Again, you have to, as much as you want to say, yay, go Curtis, right? You have to look at the circumstance it was ratified, that there is some evidence to suggest that it was made differently for different races. There's evidence, you can't deny it. But what's your mode of interpretation? Are you focusing on their intentions or just the text itself?
One thing, I just wondered, in defining the rights of citizens, even just to be able to bring suit and not give them the full scope of privileges, the Constitution allows citizens of like foreign nations to sue U.S. courts. And to me, that would seem like kind of an intent of the framers to grant that right to all people, no matter what your status is. Do you find any merit to that?
So, say one more time. I think I missed you somewhere in the middle.
So my understanding is the Constitution gives the right to bring a suit in U.S. courts to all people, even citizens of foreign subjects,
Right.
citizens of foreign nations who have an actionable claim. And to me, that seems like intent of the founders to give that right to all people regardless of their status.
Who gets to decide if you're a citizen of a foreign nation? The foreign nation, right? The king gets to decide who his citizens are. So I think it merely delegates the question to a foreign country. You know, imagine, like, you know, you've seen the movie, the Tom Hanks movie, The Terminal, right, where the guy's stuck in the airport because his country doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
I never thought of this. Is he a citizen? Could he bring a suit in any court? He's no citizenship. Huh. It's a pro exam question, right? But the guy has no citizenship, right? So could he ever bring any lawsuit in diversity? I had never thought of it that way. Other questions? You things keep going. Yes, ma'am.
After reading the opinion, it made me think about indentured servants.
Yeah.
Because they were considered property at one point. So when they were freed, do they get all the laws now? Because Justice Tawny is saying that, you know, if you were brought over here with the intention of being property, you're never going to be a citizen.
Oh, that's a
How
good
does that
point.
work?
That's a good point. I don't think he mentioned indentured servants, does he? No, it might be in the 200-page version, which I cover your book. You can check later. I'm not sure. But I think Regina raised a fair point. She asked, what about indentured servant, right? Someone brought here, bound to service for X number of years, and then after paid off his time, whenever he's freed. I think, and you can tell from right or wrong, that Tawny would say it wouldn't matter that by virtue of the person's race, they could never be a citizen, even if they're only brought in a short-term contract. But this point of indentured servitude, actually, it's a good segue. When we go to the 13th Amendment, right, which I'll do in a minute, but it says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude. Okay, so it's not just slavery. It's also involuntary servitude, which indentured servants may fall under, right? And you know where the phrase indentured servant comes from? It's how were contracts made back in the day to prove they were authentic, right? You take a big piece of paper and you write the contract on two sides of the paper. Then you take a scissor and cut it down the middle like this with a very jagged shape, and you separate them. Party A gets one piece, party B gets the other piece. How would you determine it's authentic? You put it back together. This jagged edge was called an indenture. That's what they call indentured service. You basically give one copy to the owner and one copy to the servant. And then after 10 years, whatever, they put it back together. And they so that's where the phrase indentured service, you're welcome. That's where the indentured service phrase comes from. But I think Regina raises a fair point that the 13th Amendment prohibited not only slavery, but also involuntary servitude. Yeah, Cameron?
One thing already, Tawny glossed over this, and I'm sure just because the opinions of the gentleman at the time, it could have been a real thing to strengthen the argument, but what about those who are citizens, like women, who are citizens, but don't have the same, privileges as others? And Tawny just says, well, that just happens.
No. Actually, there's an answer here. It's in the reading as well. And actually, let me move on to the 14th Amendment. I'm going to answer your question, Mick Cameron. Any other questions on Dred Scott? Right? Let me summarize the holding very grossly for you, right? So first, Missouri Compromise, unconstitutional because Congress doesn't have power over rules in the new territories, right? Second, Fifth Amendment, to deprive a slave owner of his property is to deprive him of his liberty and property without due process of law, and there's no compensation. And the basic holding is that Scott and all people of African descent, whether slave or indentured, all people, cannot be citizens by virtue of their inferiority. And therefore they can't use diversity citizenship to go to federal court. So Mr. Scott got nothing, no relief at all. Okay, any questions on the holding of Dred Scott? I summarized in 30 seconds, it's a long reading, but I think that's the nutshell. Yeah, go ahead.
Question, several procedure questions on the way, but how does he get from a holding of no jurisdiction to being able to, I mean, if that's the case, then anytime the Supreme Court hears a case, they can say, hey, we don't have jurisdiction, but we're going to say that this is unconstitutional.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost like when the Supreme Court holds that, it can be held as a tax, but it's 20 minutes talking about the Commerce Clause.
Yeah, I mean, I don't understand how this became a big deal, because he said no jurisdiction, but wait a minute, I'm just gonna start rambling off this ignorant stuff, and it's gonna actually be binding on something that Congress has passed.
Yeah, I mean, Clint, your question's not wrong. It's not a CIFRO question either. It's the function of a judge. And should a judge go out of his way to resolve really, really important constitutional questions when the court lacks jurisdiction? Which is why I think, if you were to ask me, the opinion should be one page. Lack of jurisdiction, dismissed, done.
So what you're telling me is, using constitutional law, a judge can say, I don't have jurisdiction, but I can now invalidate enormous years of progress and years of Congress legislative action with one stroke of a pen. Or
that's what he did. Whether he could do it is question different than whether he did it, but he did it. It didn't work, because basically everyone ignored it.
Okay.
Right? Congress continued to legislate in the territories even after this case.
That's what I'm sure I'm striking it, because that's a very big expansion of Article 3 if this stands. And we're talking about today, so it somewhat stood. So is it interpreted to say the judges have that power?
Well, look, I mean, so I'll get you a second, Raquel. This is what the book refers to as anti-canon.
Yeah.
So you're learning this today not because it's a correct way of going about constitutional law, but because it's the incorrect way of going about it. And Clint, one of the reasons why it's so not correct is because the region identified that it could have been dismissed in one sentence for lack of jurisdiction, maybe a page. We'll probably take a page. The fact that he didn't means judges should not emulate this.
Okay.
And if you're writing a brief or writing a case and you're citing Dred Scott favorably, you're probably not in very good shape. Conversely, if you're writing a brief and you can say, my opponent is doing something like Dred Scott, oh, now you're in business, right? That's where the anti-canon comes into play. It's not only don't cite it, but try to peg your opponent as you're relying on the same sort of reasoning. Saying, whoa, they're asking us to reach this broad question. Don't be like Dred Scott. Don't be like Taney, right? You see the effect of that, right? It's not just I'm not doing it. It's he's trying to do Taney. Don't do Taney. Kevin, I think I saw another hand somewhere else. Raquel, please, and then Kevin, Gabriel, or Kevin. I'm sorry. No, Raquel first, please. I'm sorry, I'm confusing myself.
So, because he wasn't a citizen and therefore they didn't have jurisdiction over him, then the Missouri Compromise being unconstitutional, all of that, were they binding?
That's Lincoln, right? Lincoln said, look, Congress and the federal government were not parties to this case. Therefore, Congress was not bound by it, and they continue legislating for the Missouri territories. I'm sorry, for the Wisconsin territories, right? That's, I want to make sure this point's clear. I think Raquel put her question well. Lincoln said the federal government was not a party to Dred Scott, therefore they're in no way bound by Taney's holding. He wasn't saying, let's just ignore Taney's because the guy's a moron, right? He didn't say that. He was a little bit more smart than that. He said, we have to follow binding judgments. Dred Scott was not a binding judgment on us, therefore we are not bound. Now, Kevin.
So, I guess the main point Taney's trying to make is that the word of the Supreme Court is violence. It covers everything.
That's it.
But isn't that kind of, and he used that to justify slavery, but then, I mean, a few years later, Confederacy comes and says, oh, well, we want states' rights to do what they need. But doesn't that kind of go against Taney's point then, where he's justifying federal authority, and it goes against kind of what the Confederacy wants? And then Curtis basically says, yeah, no, slavery is a municipal issue.
Well, I think the Southerners would say that Taney was right, and that it's the North that's ignoring the Constitution. Although they ratified their own Constitution, so it didn't really matter. I saw a hand over there. Is that Warren?
Yeah, it was just, because Clint was, like, bringing up the idea that, how can it be a binding decision if they don't have jurisdiction? And I know that it's part of the anti-canon, but just because it's part of the anti-canon doesn't mean that the court can't make binding decisions when it doesn't have jurisdiction. I mean, Marbury v. Madison.
Oh, what a good question! Everyone already said, right? Marbury.
Yeah, but the fact, they have to make a decision saying that they don't have jurisdiction to hear the case. That decision itself is binding, and anything that attaches to it is also binding.
Very good.
It might not make much like legislative sense, then I guess that's when like the
Yeah.
legal, the laws of history goes on to
Yeah.
it because everybody decides to follow it. So it
Yeah.
becomes part of the
Very good.
common law.
Everyone hear Warren's question. Let me repeat it if I didn't hear it. He says, well, that Marbury, right? Didn't John Marshall hold that the court lacks jurisdiction? If the court lacked jurisdiction, why would they need to hold that the Judiciary Act of 1789 is unconstitutional? Sam?
There's a difference between this case and that case. In Marbury, he still didn't have his commission. In this case, Dred Scott had already been freed by the time he was at the Supreme Court, right?
Well, Marbury never got his commission.
Well, I'm saying, but at the time the case was heard, he still didn't have it.
Well, okay, let me answer Warren's question, right? John Marshall could write a one-page opinion saying, I don't have jurisdiction to issue mandamus here. Done. Dismissed. He didn't. He went that long route. So Warren's point is, all this BS about the anti-canon, how was what Tawney did different than what Marshall did? That's why I think Marshall's quite overrated. I actually had a call from a reporter. He was asking me to talk about Tawney, and I was like, let's talk about Marshall for a minute. And I dumped on Marshall for a while. But there's a lot of bad stuff there, too. He had an opinion called Johnson versus McIntosh. You read that in Property?
Yeah.
Marshall. The language that Marshall uses for Native Americans in Johnson is not that different than the language Tawney uses for Africans in Dred Scott. It's actually very similar. I told the reporters, like, wow. And I actually got the New York Times to print an attack on John Marshall for his Indian opinion. I felt gratified. Not rehabilitating Tawney, but debilitating Marshall. Clint.
One comment. So, kind of touch on Warren's, but I understand Tawney's going into explaining how they justified no jurisdiction because he felt that Dred Scott was not a citizen. But I don't understand is then how come he said, well, hey, I don't have jurisdiction. I've established that with all this ignorance.
Mm-hmm.
Now I've already established it. Now I'm going to move over to this other part that had no relevance on the case.
Yeah.
The second part, why the due process law, that had no relevance on the case at all. When he went after with the compromise, the 36-degree.
Yeah.
He went after that. There was no reason for that. I understand that.
There was no reason whatsoever.
He explains why Dred Scott's not a citizen. I understand that, but then he just says, hey, I'm going to take on a subject that's not even being litigated. I'm going to talk about Kool-Aid, and this, which was not even relevant to the case, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, you're not wrong. All right, let me walk you through the 13th, 14th, we have a few minutes left. What you have to understand about the 13th and 14th Amendments, these were designed to directly overturn specific aspects of Dred Scott, right? That was the purpose. The 13th Amendment, which we'll talk about in the next class, says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. This applies not only to government, but also applies to private individuals. This was basically the first part of the Constitution that controlled private conduct. To date, the Constitution only controlled state action. This controlled private conduct. Now, this business, and I'll take Regina's question a little bit differently, except this punishment for a crime, there were a lot of cases where people were arrested for vagrancy, breaching contracts, BS claims, and they were put into an indentured servitude position. Chain gangs, right? Oh, brother, where art thou, right? So there were actually ways of basically throwing people back into slavery without calling it slavery. That didn't go away. Next, I want to talk about the 14th Amendment. There are 4 clauses that are designed to specifically override Dred Scott. The first one we discussed. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the states wherein they reside. Okay, again, you are now a citizen of both the U.S. and of the state by virtue of birth. That kills Tawney's holding. He says they can never be citizens. This expressly reverses it. The second clause, which you'll read about next week, or for next class, I'm sorry, is a privileges or immunities clause. Now, do not confuse, please don't confuse, the privileges and immunities clause in Article 4 with the Privileges or Immunities Clause in the 14th Amendment. How do I remember it? Article 4 comes first. It's A and, right? A comes before O. Privileges and Immunities Clause in Article 4. Privileges or Immunities Clause in the 14th Amendment. Again, what Tawney said is because people are not citizens, they can't have these privileges. This says expressly they do. And states cannot deny these privileges. What these rights are, we'll study next week, but this is a very big deal. So again, the freedmen were citizens, and by virtue of being a citizen, they had these rights. Very powerful statements. Okay? Right? What did Tawney hold? That slaves had no rights to liberty. That's gone. No person can be denied of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That expressly, you are now a person, and you cannot be held in deprivation of your liberty. Right? The final one, no state shall deny to any person equal protection of the laws. This ensured that laws would be applied equally, and not just to any citizens, but all persons. All right. So the 14th Amendment was designed to give power to Congress under Section 5, which you studied, to reverse the vestiges, the remainders of slavery. Questions? Andy? All right, I'll see you on Thursday.